an executive producer came to me and said, I really want you for this role and you're perfect for the part. And diametrically 180-degree total opposite.
He was the soul of the Karate Kid, a soft-spoken guide who turned a simple story about bullies and karate into something timeless. Mr. Miyagi's words became mantras, his presence a calm shield for Daniel LaRusso, and his wisdom shaped audiences far beyond the dojo. But for the man behind Miyagi, Pat Morita, the journey was far less serene. For decades, fans only knew the jokes, the one-liners, the sitcom appearances that had once defined his career. Few realized that Morita had carried a secret history about the making of the Karate Kid.
Hey! What the hell you think you're doing? Huh? Look at my dog. You turned him into a damn chicken.
A story that nearly cost him the role and almost changed the movie forever. He didn't share it during the film's success, nor during its sequels, and not even when Hollywood once again typecast him as the comic. It wasn't until late in life, when his health was failing and his voice carried the weight of final reflection, that Pat Morita finally revealed the truth.
Let's see how good you really are.
Behind the laughter and the crane's stance, there had been battles no camera captured, closed-door fights that determined whether he would ever step onto the set at all. So what really happened during those early days? What unseen struggle shaped the legend of Mr. Miyagi? And why did Pat wait until the end to finally speak? When people think of the Karate Kid, they think of Daniel learning patience, balance, and strength from the quiet handyman with the clipped words and the sharp gaze. Mr. Miyagi was the film's heartbeat, but what many fans never knew is that Pat Morita almost never got the chance to play him. In Hollywood at the time, Morita's name carried baggage. He was known as a stand-up comic, a sitcom side character, a man who could deliver a punchline with ease. To audiences, he was funny. To executives, he was light. And to Jerry Weintraub, the powerhouse producer of The Karate Kid, he was the last person who could bring weight to a character scarred by war, grief, and loneliness. Weintraub didn't just hesitate, he actively pushed back. Whenever Morita's name surfaced in early casting conversations, he would swat it away. Not him, he reportedly snapped, convinced that the role required an actor with gravitas, someone the audience could take seriously the moment he walked on screen. For weeks, Morita wasn't even granted an audition. Casting directors scoured headshots and screen-tested other actors, anyone but him. From their perspective, the comedian from Happy Days had no business trying to play a stoic mentor. But John Avildsen, the director, saw things differently. He knew that The Karate Kid wasn't just a story about kicks and punches. It was about trust, growth, and unlikely friendship. And he wasn't about to let a single possibility slip past him. Avildsen insisted Morita be given a chance, even if it meant clashing with his own producer. That push was all it took to crack open the wall. When Morita finally walked into the room weeks later, it wasn't because Hollywood wanted him. It was because one director refused to stop fighting. Morita would later say that those early days were like watching his entire career teeter on a razor's edge. If Avildsen had backed down, he never would have been seen at all. And without that stubborn insistence, the role of Mr. Miyagi, the role that changed his life, might have gone to someone else entirely. By the early 80s, Pat Morita's career looked like it was fading. The comedy clubs that once gave him steady gigs were booking newer faces, and his sitcom days felt far behind him. Instead of chasing down every casting call in Los Angeles, he spent much of his time in Hawaii, taking whatever work he could find, emceeing banquets, writing ad copy, even small nightclub spots. It paid the bills, but it wasn't Hollywood, and it certainly wasn't the kind of work that built legends. For the first time in his life, Morita let himself slow down. He stopped shaving, let his hair grow long, and carried himself more like a man drifting through life than an entertainer ready for a camera. He joked later that he looked more like a beach bum with jokes than an actor, but that unpolished look, scruffy beard, weathered face, tired eyes, would end up being one of the greatest strokes of fate in his career. When the script for The Karate Kid finally landed in his hands, it wasn't because Hollywood had been waiting for him. In fact, he nearly missed it altogether. One afternoon, after meeting with his agent about ending their contract, Morita walked toward the door, ready to leave Los Angeles behind. Then a secretary rushed out. calling his name. His agent waved him back. "Pat, don't go yet. There's a script I think you should see." That script was The Karate Kid. It was almost too neat a story for Hollywood itself. An actor nearly slipping through the cracks, pulled back by a coincidence, holding in his hands the role that would change his life. Morita would later say it felt like destiny had yanked him back inside that office. If he hadn't paused on the sidewalk, if he hadn't kept that agent for just a little longer, Miyagi might have been lost to him forever. And when the audition finally came, the beard he'd grown in Hawaii, the same beard that had nothing to do with acting, gave him the look of a man who had weathered storms. Without knowing it, he had stepped into Miyagi's skin long before the camera ever rolled. When Pat Morita finally got the call to audition, he braced himself for the usual Hollywood circus. A table of producers, assistants scribbling notes, maybe even a few stares that screamed, "You don't belong here." But the room he walked into was nothing like that. Instead, he found John Avildsen. The director of Rocky was standing there, not behind a desk, but strapped into a camera rig, half filmmaker, half machine. One arm cradled the lens, the other balanced a heavy battery pack slung across his chest. From the very first handshake, Avildsen never lowered the camera. "Tell me about yourself," he asked, still peering through the viewfinder. So Morita didn't deliver a polished audition speech. He just talked about his career, his struggles, his time in Hawaii, the way his life had zigzagged between comedy clubs and odd jobs. Avildsen recorded every second. It wasn't a test of lines, it was a test of truth. Then came the script. Morita read, but not with the energy of a comedian chasing laughs. He slowed down, let the pauses breathe, leaned into Miyagi's quiet strength. By the end, he expected a polite thank you, maybe a nod, and then dismissal. Instead, Avildsen stopped him at the door. "Pat," he said, still with that camera on his shoulder, "don't you want to keep the script? You might need it." It was the first crack in the wall of doubt. Later, when Weintraub and the studio executives argued about casting, Avildsen simply pressed play on that tape. Morita appeared on screen, bearded, weathered, utterly convincing. The room fell silent. Even Weintraub, the man who swore he didn't want a comedian anywhere near Miyagi, had to admit, that looks like Miyagi. That one strange audition, just Morita and a director with a camera, became the proof that shifted everything. For the first time, people stopped seeing Pat the comic and started seeing Mr. Miyagi. For most actors, one strong audition is enough. For Pat Morita, it took 5. Even after John Avildsen's tape convinced the doubters that he could be Miyagi, the studio wasn't ready to hand over the role. They wanted certainty. They wanted guarantees. And so Morita was put through a gauntlet of screen tests, each one designed to answer the same question. Could this comedian truly transform into the soul of the Karate Kid? The first 2 were simple. Could he recreate the gravitas from his taped audition, word for word, emotion for emotion? He did. With each read, Morita's posture stiffened, his tone deepened, and the weight of Mr. Miyagi began to feel less like acting and more like inhabiting a man who had lived through pain. But the third test raised the stakes. Ralph Macchio. The chemistry between Daniel and Miyagi wasn't optional. It was the film's core. If they didn't connect, the story would collapse. So Macchio flew in, still a young actor from New York, and sat across from Morita. Together they read the scenes, the quiet lessons, the moments of tension, the silences that said more than words. Something clicked. Ralph responded to Morita as if he were a real mentor, not just a scene partner. Morita, in turn, listened with warmth, correcting him with a glance, guiding him with a breath. The bond felt natural, unscripted. For the first time, the producers saw the father-son dynamic that would anchor the film. The fourth test added costume. Morita stepped out in a simple GI, beard and hair framing his face, and suddenly the comic from Happy Days was gone. Ralph later admitted the transformation startled him. Standing in front of him wasn't Pat anymore. It was Miyagi. But the studio wanted one final assurance. The fifth test took place on a bare soundstage. No props, no backdrop, just Pat, Ralph, and the camera. They ran the scenes again, stripped to their essence. When it ended, the silence in the room was telling. Even the skeptics had nothing left to question. By the end of 5 grueling rounds, one truth was undeniable. Pat Morita wasn't playing Miyagi. He was Miyagi. After 5 auditions, endless readings, and chemistry tests that left everyone in awe, Pat Morita had proven himself. Yet one shadow still loomed over him. Jerry Weintraub, the producer who had fought hardest to keep him out of the role, wasn't fully convinced. And in Hollywood, the word of a producer could still break even the strongest case. Then came the phone call. Morita was at home, waiting, nerves coiled tight. He knew he had given everything he had, but he also knew the politics of casting. Talent wasn't always enough. Sometimes it came down to one man's opinion, and that man had spent weeks saying no. Weintraub picked up the phone anyway. His voice, normally sharp and commanding, carried something unexpected: humility. "Pat," he said slowly, "I almost made the biggest mistake of my career. Congratulations, you're our Mr. Miyagi." For Morita, it was more than just a job offer. It was vindication. The same man who had once dismissed him as nothing more than a comic was now admitting he had been wrong. Pat didn't gloat. He didn't rub it in. He just accepted, quietly, with a sense of pride that needed no words. From that moment, the power balance shifted. The comedian nobody wanted was now the cornerstone of the film. The set, the cast, and even Weintraub himself had to acknowledge that the Karate Kid would not work without Pat Morita. He had climbed the mountain, but the real challenge was only beginning. Once the cameras rolled, he had to convince not just producers, but audiences everywhere that Miyagi was more than a mentor. He was a man whose broken English carried wisdom, sorrow, and poetry. Winning the role was one victory. Bringing Mr. Miyagi to life was another. Pat Morita knew that how Miyagi sounded could define everything. If the voice fell into parody, audiences might laugh at the wrong moments. If it was too polished, it wouldn't fit the backstory of an immigrant janitor and war veteran. Somewhere in between, there had to be a rhythm that gave Miyagi dignity without erasing his struggle. Ironically, the spark came from exhaustion. During one of his early readings, Morita was worn down from weeks of fighting for the role. His words slowed, his delivery broke into short, clipped phrases. It wasn't a choice. It was fatigue. But Avildsen saw something in it. The pauses carried weight. The halting grammar felt authentic, like a man who had learned English late in life, but thought carefully before each word. Morita leaned into it. Instead of fearing broken English would be a weakness, he shaped it into poetry. His Miyagi didn't chatter. He distilled thoughts into sharp, memorable lines. Wax on, wax off. Man who catch fly with chopstick accomplish anything. Simple phrases, but delivered with a gravity that made them unforgettable. Ralph Macchio later admitted he was stunned. He had known Pat as a quick-tongued comedian, but on set, he found a different man entirely. Quiet, deliberate, with words that seemed to settle the air around him. Daniel's nervous energy bounced perfectly against Miyagi's calm staccato. The contrast wasn't scripted. It was alive between them. The studio still worried. Would audiences laugh? Would critics call it caricature? Morita worried too. He understood Hollywood's history of stereotyping accents, but he trusted his instincts. If he played Miyagi with dignity, audiences would hear truth instead of mockery. And they did. That halting cadence became one of cinema's most recognizable voices. Kids mimicked it on playgrounds. Comedians borrowed it for sketches. But at its core, it was never a joke. Morita had turned a potential liability into a signature, giving Miyagi not just a voice, but a soul. For Pat Morita, the Karate Kid wasn't just another job. It was a second life, a chance to be remembered not as a comic, but as an actor with depth. While fans recall crane kicks and training montages, Morita held on to quieter moments. Scenes that revealed not only Miyagi's heart, but his own. One memory burned brightest: the drunk Miyagi scene. Executives had doubts, worried that showing the mentor broken and grieving would ruin the character's mystique. Morita disagreed. To him, Miyagi's pain was essential. So late one night, with cameras rolling, he poured everything into it. The grief of losing his wife and child, the loneliness behind the wise mask. When the scene ended, the set fell into silence. No applause, no chatter, just reverence. Ralph Macchio later said it was the moment he realized Pat wasn't just playing Miyagi, he was Miyagi. Another favorite memory was lighter, the chopsticks and fly gag. On paper it was comic relief, but Morita played it with laser focus, as if catching the fly really mattered. When Daniel snatched the insect instead, the laughter that followed wasn't forced, it was genuine. Morita loved that beat because it showed Miyagi could be both serious and playful, mentor and friend. Off-screen, his bond with Ralph grew just as strong. Makio was still a teenager navigating sudden fame, and Marita often looked out for him. Their relationship mirrored the one on screen, teacher and student, but also protector and companion. Ralph would later call it the heart of the movie, on screen and off. Even the crew, skeptical at first, came around. Early whispers questioned if a comedian could carry such a role. By the time the tournament scenes were filmed, those whispers were gone, replaced by respect. To many on set, Pat wasn't just an actor anymore. He was sensei. These moments mattered more to Morita than box office numbers. Long after the cameras stopped, what he remembered most weren't the kicks or the fame. It was the silences, the laughter, and the friendships that made Miyagi real. Near the end of his life, Pat Morita often spoke of the Karate Kid with a mix of pride and gratitude. For him, Mr. Miyagi wasn't just a character, he was redemption. After years of being typecast as a comedian, after nearly being shut out of the role entirely, he had finally been able to show the world the depth he always carried inside. In interviews, Morita would reflect on how fragile it all was. A stubborn producer, a lucky beard, a director with a camera. So many tiny twists had determined whether or not he'd even be given a chance. If one thing had gone differently, he admitted, I might never have been Miyagi. That awareness stayed with him until his final days. He also recognized the burden of what came after. Playing Miyagi brought him international fame, but it also meant he was forever tied to that one role. Audiences struggled to see him as anyone else. To some, he was only the wise old sensei with the broken English. Morita wrestled with that, but he never grew bitter. Instead, he leaned into gratitude. He knew how many actors never got even one role that defined a generation. He had been given that gift. Most of all, he cherished the bond it created. With Ralph Macchio, with fans, and with people who saw in Miyagi the father, mentor, or friend they wished they had. Miyagi gave people hope, he once said softly, and that's something I'll always be thankful for. In those last reflections, Pat Morita didn't speak of box office numbers or awards. He spoke of the character who gave him a second chance at life, and the joy of knowing he left behind something that mattered. For him, Mr. Miyagi wasn't just a role, he was a legacy. Pat Morita's final words remind us that legends are built not only on screen, but in the struggles no one sees. His journey from rejection to legacy proves that one role can change everything. If Morita's story moved you, hit like, share your favorite Miyagi moment in the comments, and subscribe for more Untold Hollywood True.